Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Chill Like a Mother podcast. Today, I am here with Hayley Dunlop, and we are going to be talking about the complexities of being a creative and a mother, even if you haven't always identified with that word. And as we start today's conversation, I just want to preface everything with if you're not in a particularly creative place, or it's not something that you're drawn to, not something you've ever really thought about, I just want you to know that there could be wisdom and little bits of pieces in the episode, even if you don't necessarily identify with that. For me, creativity and curiosity and imagination is in the top three of my, kind of core values that lead actions and lead my life. And that has always been true, but it's not always the case for everyone. So, Hayley, can you share with me some of the adjectives or the words that you would have described yourself with pre-motherhood and now motherhood?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on your lovely podcast. Before I had children, let me think. I would have described myself as organized, responsible, and probably very reliable. And I think the career that I was in at the time sort of encompassed all of those sort of qualities and values. I was working in corporate PR. I was very on it. I was on call. I had to be a reliable person because I was a spokesperson for quite a high profile brand. And I was successful. I was very successful at what I did. And then I was pregnant with my first child, who's now 9 years old. And yeah, let's just say that it doesn't just feel like a lifetime ago. It feels almost like a sort of whole human ago, describing myself that way.
Yes. And tell me about how creativity was kind of thrust on you as you entered motherhood and became a caregiver to another human being.
Yeah, I mean, definitely wasn't an immediate thing at all because I'm sure many people listening can relate to the fact that when you have a baby, especially your first baby, you're just in survival mode. You are learning how to be an entirely different person and an entirely different identity. The way that I described it is that it's almost like when I had my first baby, it was almost like I was turned inside out. All of the kind of values and adjectives that I associated with myself suddenly just kind of disappeared. They weren't needed anymore. Organized, yes, reliable, yes, but suddenly I was expected to have way more energy and way more physical capacity and way more wide awakeness than I'd ever had at any moment in my life before. And absolutely just completely knocked me for six. And to be honest, I think I was in that mode up until after I'd had my second child. So we're talking 3 years of just being in this survival pattern of just getting by day. I absolutely did not go back to my PR career after I had children. I decided to focus on copywriting, which was an element of my job up until that point, because I've always just loved writing. It's always just felt very kind of natural and enjoyable. But as the years went on, as I was a mother, it didn't just become natural and enjoyable, it actually became necessary. I'd never felt that compulsion to write so fiercely as when I was processing this whole transition from me to mother. And writing really, really helped me to untangle so much in those early years of motherhood. But then it was really COVID, pandemic, lockdown when everything really started to change for me in terms of realizing that maybe I was a creative person after all.
Can you say more about that?
So when lockdown hit in the UK, we're talking March 2020, which I think it was probably similar for everyone everywhere. And I had my eldest was 4. He'd just started his first few months in school. And my youngest was, oh, she was a little toddler, so about 18 months old. And my son was absolutely loving school, and my daughter was absolutely hating nursery. So we had, we always had this kind of like push pull, tug of war, battle, figuring out what the best was for our family unit in terms of, where the children wanted and needed to be. And before COVID hit, we just were on this treadmill. I kind of see it as like we were on this treadmill of life. We were doing what we'd always done. And then obviously the treadmill just stopped and like kind of like we tumbled off it. That's the way I kind of visualize what happened. And when we hit the ground, each of us dealt with it in like very different ways. So my son, he missed school so much. He's an extrovert. He needed that routine. He needed his friends. He needed constant stimulation and constant sort of social exposure. And that all just fell away. And it just became extremely challenging with him at home. On the contrary, my youngest, who I mentioned was about 1.5, suddenly became like a different child. She was absolutely loving being at home. And I found that fascinating because I realized that if I'd have been a child when COVID struck, even a young child or when I was at school as a teenager, I would have absolutely loved to have been stuck at home. That would have been my dream. And seeing it kind of like there with my own eyes, that, oh my goodness, here's another human who has suddenly got this opportunity that I never had, which was just to be at home with the people she loved the most in her safe space. And that really opened my eyes to like the treadmill image. And suddenly here I was with an opportunity to step off that treadmill. And so stepping off that treadmill was so major. And it suddenly I had the urge to just write. I just cannot explain it. There was an online writers group that an amazing woman and book coach called Georgina Green set up towards the start of lockdown in 2020. And like I mentioned at the time, I was a copywriter, so I was writing for a living, but it was, I was writing for a brand. It wasn't, groundbreaking stuff. And she set up this group of mothers in lockdown who just wanted to come together once a week and write. And there were no expectations about what we were writing. We could be just free journaling, we could be writing poetry, we could be doing freelance copywriting, or we could be writing fiction. And I began joining those groups every Sunday evening once the kids were in bed. And it was just this, I describe it as like a refuge. It became like my weekly refuge. That was really the only time back then when, we were all holed up at home 24/7, that I could just have time for myself and time for me, kind of hunker down and just write. And at the beginning I was writing this kind of lockdown journal, but it got very like depressing and it wasn't really bringing me any joy whatsoever. And it was only a few months in as we kind of approached the winter lockdown of 2020, which was like a very dark time for me in terms of my anxiety and mental health, that I decided to start writing a completely different project, which was a romantic comedy novel. I'd never had any notion before then that I was going to write a rom-com, but I started writing a romantic comedy in winter 2020, continued, it was the first time I'd ever stuck at a project, thanks to the co-writing group. And a year later, I'd finished a novel for the first time in my life. And just a sense of kind of joy and fulfillment and just like sort of peace that just this sort of ritual and routine had given me during that very, very difficult time made me realize that I was a creative person. This was all of my ideas and, yes, it's a rom-com, but there are so many kind of themes and influences and kind of issues that are all kind of wrapped up in this story. But it was important for me that it was told in a kind of joyful and comforting way, because I think that was what we were all lacking back then, was just those comforts that we'd all taken for granted for so long. So yeah, at this point, I'd been a mother at this point now for maybe 6 years. And that was the point where I was like, oh my goodness, I've just written a book. I wasn't expecting that. And that was really the first time I'd ever been able to call myself a writer. For my whole life, even though I've been, paid to write for most of my career, I've always been interested in writing. But it was just the kind of compulsion that took hold once motherhood kicked in and once the treadmill stopped. And the challenge now, of course, is now all of everybody's treadmills have started back up again. To what extent do we actually want to kind of hop back on? What speed do we want to put that treadmill at? And also, what do you do in a family whose treadmills all operate at different rates? And how do you kind of marry that and make peace with my son's treadmill? He wants to just be kind of like sprinting like Usain Bolt 24/7, compared to my daughter, who'd quite happily just turn the treadmill off and just lie on it. Which frankly would be my choice as well. So yeah, that's where we are at the moment. Delightfully, I've recently been given a publishing contract for that book. Nothing's been formally announced yet, but yeah, there's going to be an announcement soon, and yeah, I'm going to have my first novel published next year, so I'm very excited about that.
Incredible, incredible. And oh, thank you for sharing those pieces of yourself with me. Similar stages of motherhood, though halfway across the world. My child was just 5 when the lockdown hit, and I had an 8-month-old. And
Wow.
So also similar temperaments in that way. My son needs lots of stimulation and action structure, needs never, I don't think ever once didn't want to go to daycare ever. Like just never. Actually was upset when I would pick him up.
Exactly the
before
same.
4 o'clock.
Exactly. There was no separation anxiety here. It was kind of like pickup anxiety.
Yes. I don't want to go home. I want to be here. Yeah. And my youngest, not old enough to real show some of those temperament pieces, hadn't started daycare yet. But was also just very content to be at home. And also watching the very overstimulated brother run laps around the house as we were contained. And I started painting in the pandemic.
Wow.
I would just like get a canvas and just like splash paint around. There was no agenda, no shape, no like thing that I was trying to create. It felt like it was the only thing that was mine. My bed wasn't mine. My body wasn't mine yet. I couldn't even go to work, which I love. Like I love my job.
Yeah.
And it felt like it was the only thing that was mine. And it felt so cathartic to just spend 15 minutes even on it. And my family started to see the positive impact of me having something that was just mine. And then with the support of my husband, it was like that time was very guarded for me. It was like, you don't interrupt Mom when she's doing that. He would very diligently keep the kids, away from my space. And it truly breathed life into me in a time when I felt like I was so broken.
Yeah, that's so familiar. That definitely resonates with me in terms of what I was feeling back then. And did you paint much before then, or was this a new urge that you'd had?
I had painted in the sense of like mixed media art journaling, but
Hmm.
that was the first time that I'd like bought a canvas and and really had the intention of just allowing whatever to happen.
Yeah, I mean that was equivalent with me writing a romantic comedy, I think. I had no idea what the story was going to be when I started writing it. I had one idea that I wanted to explore, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. So, yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? How that compulsion kind of pushes itself to the surface when we most need it, but also B, when we are off that treadmill and when we do suddenly have the opportunity, even though there was hardly any opportunity, let's be honest, but there arguably is more opportunity to explore that part of yourself at that moment in history than there otherwise would have been. And I honestly don't think, for me, if it hadn't have been for the lockdown and the pandemic, which don't get me wrong, I would never ever want to repeat that time ever again. But if it hadn't have been for it, I wouldn't be here now, like on the cusp of having a novel published. And yeah, that blows my mind a little bit, to be honest.
Yes. Yes. Share with me, if you can, how you continue to honor that urge, to honor that part of yourself now that you're back on the treadmill.
Yeah, that's been very tricky. So the treadmill started up again, I guess, latter half of 2021 into 2022. And I'd been in my sort of current job at that point, and I'd managed to keep working. I was still working, but I was working from home. Um, and I just knew I needed to do something new. I needed to do something different. So at the back of my mind, I was hopeful that I would get an agent for my book and a book deal, and I did get an agent, but the book deal has been years in the making, so it's absolutely no kind of reliable income from this project at all. I found a creative agency based in London who were looking for a copywriter, and I'd never considered working for an agency before. I always thought I was sort of like an in-house kind of person, very focused on a brand that I felt was aligned with my values, and so I could focus on really sort of nailing that brand's voice and doing something that felt meaningful. And this agency happens to represent brands and charities and non-profits who are all working for social good. So they kind of describe themselves as like an ethical creative agency. We've got this certification. I'm not sure if it exists in Canada, called the B Corp certification. It's like a sort of global benchmark for ensuring that the work you do is for the good of people and the planet, which means that all of the projects we work on have to sort of reach certain criteria. And it just means that every single project I work on, I was lucky enough to get the job. And it's a part-time job, which means I can do my creative writing around it, which is fantastic. It means that I'm kind of like exercising that creative muscle every single day. Always loved copywriting and words and just being really geeky with language and puns. I used to have this pun website. Oh, and I love the New Yorker caption contest every week, which is like my favorite thing to do. Um, but now my job, I could be working on like three, four, five different projects every single week, and they are so creative, working on campaigns, working on branding, working on naming, which is one of my favorite things to do, is if like there's a campaign that needs a name or a new brand that needs a name, that's just like delightful. I can just like dive into the thesaurus and put my music on and just kind of like play with words, which is just wonderful. So now, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I realized what it was that kind of made me feel good from a work perspective in the process of like learning about this creative side of myself. And I've been very fortunate to find a job that enables me to actually put those skills into practice on a daily basis. So it to me now, it doesn't feel like, oh, I do a job and then the creative stuff comes, in all of the spaces in between parenting and that job, because the job itself is super creative. And I think the most wonderful thing for me about it is in all of the kind of jobs I've done previously, and there've been many. I've been working since 2003, so over 20 years now since university. I've never worked amongst other creatives before. I've always been kind of like a little pocket of an organization where there's maybe like just a very small group of us who are creative people working in a very uncreative environment and having to kind of like basically battle for any recognition or autonomy as creatives. And that can be soul destroying. I now realize why I was finding it so soul destroying, because I wasn't being allowed to be creative. I was being constrained. Whereas now, working just surrounded by like artists and amazing designers and illustrators, and like every single person who works for this organization is just incredible, and I'm very lucky. But just the amount of talent that is there and the amount of value that they put on creativity, and knowing that creativity isn't just kind of sat at your computer like just churning it out. It's about taking time away from your computer and kind of like having that like active thinking where you're sort of, I don't know, hanging the washing out or, cooking. That's still part of the work, because that's when the ideas come. And so working for an organization that values that has been like, yeah, quite life-changing really. And I feel really, really fortunate that I was able to recognize that being creative was no longer just something that was nice and it was like, oh, this is kind of like a nice hobby. It's something that actually is like baked into me. And I just needed that moment of getting off that treadmill to kind of make me see it. So yeah, I absolutely have my children to thank for making me realize that this is who I actually am and what I want to do for the rest of my life. Kind of have pandemic to not thank, but maybe just like acknowledge briefly that without it, I probably wouldn't be here. I probably wouldn't be here either. But yeah, it's just fascinating to think, even as a child, as a teenager, had no creative inclinations whatsoever, apart from stories and writing. And I think what's a really interesting thing to think about when you think about like creativity, especially in the context of motherhood, is I think for me personally, and I don't know if this is true for like people listening as well, that whenever I thought of the word creativity, I always thought about like practical hands-on creativity. So kind of like making things and getting your hands dirty and crafts and sculpture and paint and using your body to kind of create and make something. So being like a maker. And I've never ever identified with any of that at all. Like I've always hated drawing. I even hate writing by hand. Like I find it exhausting. And I think understanding that creativity isn't just about that kind of like physical making of something. You can absolutely have like a really creative brain and still produce work without, getting a paintbrush out or like molding clay. You're kind of molding ideas. And I think that's the way that I see it, is that I've got like so many ideas all the time, and I finally kind of have like a way that I can channel them into product that people can then hopefully connect to.
Yes. Yes. There's so much in my work as an expressive arts therapist that is like unlearning what creativity is, or even
Mm,
what self-expression is, breaking down for mothers that like you just like sing in the shower. Like
yeah.
that's a form of self-expression. That's like a form of self-discovery. If you want to drop into these moments, you can like be creative about the way that you drive to work. You could be creative in the way that you approach conversations with your partner or your family members. Like there's so many parts of creativity and curiosity and imagination that we all have. There is not
Hmm.
like creative people and not creative people. There are
Yeah.
people who use creativity and people who don't.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think,
And
yeah,
we
I
are all
definitely,
creative.
yeah. And I think, yeah, you've really hit on something interesting there. And I've never thought of it that way before, is that it's not like the creativity suddenly appeared. It was just that I was using it for the first time, for sure. And I think, yeah, it's whether you allow, or you have an opportunity to kind of let that little nugget like see the light, sort of kind of be exposed to the kind of outside world. And for me, it was definitely motherhood, and then following on from that, COVID, that kind of, it wasn't like this gentle, sunrise. It was like it was almost like alien, horrible bursting out, like, oh my God, this is not pleasant, but it's necessary. Um,
And can you share with us, Hayley, one of your most recent projects with Sarah in the Entwined anthology for creative mothers?
yeah, I was absolutely chuffed to be invited to contribute to this anthology, because Sarah is this amazing artist who I've admired for years. And in fact, it was during kind of like COVID and lockdowns that we connected online. We've never actually met. And um, yeah, we've always had fascinating conversations online about creativity, life, and motherhood. So to be asked to submit a contribution to this was fantastic. I wrote an essay actually capturing a lot of what we've discussed today about how motherhood helped me to kind of like awaken the creativity inside of me that I never realized was even there. I use kind of like an analogy of color to explore that idea, and about how perhaps the colors that I thought represented me and who I am aren't my actual colors after all. So it was an extremely like cathartic, quite raw piece to write, but again, felt absolutely compelled to do so. And the anthology that Sarah has curated looks wonderful. And I can't wait to actually get my hands on a copy and sniff it. I love smelling books.
It's me too. I'm
Yeah.
like, I can't wait to hold it in my hands. So, with the anthology of Entwined, there's also a journal that she's written called Ember, and I've submitted some journal prompts to that, in particularly for mothers to explore this kind of like sense of identity and who am I now. I originally found her through the Moms Who Create podcast. I don't know if she was a guest, but I know that she was like a takeover on their Instagram. And that's how I found her. And I just love what she puts out into the world and how she
Absolutely.
connects and like stands at the intersection of motherhood and creativity and just like navigates that traffic stop. And with you, I cannot wait to like hold the book in my hands. The
Yeah,
cover is so beautiful.
and it's been like a labor of love for Sarah for years. I mean, I think the idea was literally born pre-lockdown, I think. And like the best things in life, it's taken a number of years to sort of like come together and organize. And yeah, I it looks like a really sort of stunning product, and I can't wait to, yeah, just can't wait to see it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hayley, for sharing these pieces of yourself with us today. And a pre thank you for your words in the Entwined book. I cannot wait to hear about your metaphor of colors of before and after, if you include some during. Um, as someone who lives and breathes creativity, as an expressive arts therapist, I love metaphor. I work in metaphor a lot with my clients, especially when there's resistance to actual art making,
Hmm.
when that is part of the narrative of creativity or art. Like I have to paint or I have to draw. No, thank you. I would literally rather do anything else. We talk a lot in metaphor and pulling out some of those unconscious, the imagination, pulling that to the forefront. And so I cannot wait to hear about and read your metaphor around color and motherhood.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of the prompts in Ember as well. That's definitely something I'm going to be doing, and encouraging, yeah,
Mhm.
lots of my friends to do it as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Chill Like a Mother podcast this week. We will see you or hear you. You'll hear me next week. And I wish you well. And I hope you have a creative day and or week.